as a software developer. And then we were working on things like C, C++, Visual Basic, and I don't know how many of you have heard of these things as well. But now when I got back into the space, I don't recognize the tools and frameworks that are currently exist. So it's crazy to think of how developers keep up with all of this new technology, of all of these new tools. And I think Jean Yang, who's also a software developer, sums this up nicely. She says that the new wave of tools has helped developers build bigger, better systems and also build them faster. It turns out that developers are now spending their time worrying about an unintended consequence, which is how exactly are they supposed to manage and coordinate these fast moving, heterogeneous systems and free themselves up to build. So, if at all we want great technology and great products in the future, we don't want developers to be spending their time in figuring out how to use a new tool or how to learn a new framework. What we want them to do is build good products. So where can design play a role in all of this? Where can other folks play a role in creating a better experience for developers? So this is where developer experience comes into play. So how do we create a better experience for developers? And I'll talk about what developer experience is. Okay, before we go into this, I don't know how many of you have access to the internet right now, probably either Wi-Fi or on your phones, but I would love to know, just from your perspective, what would you say your biggest pain point is when it comes to dev tooling today? You don't have to name specific tools. You can just scan this code, or if you go to slido.com and enter this, yeah, your answer should pop up here. But I would just love to know, like, what is it that you find difficult when it comes to dev tooling? Hopefully this works. Yeah, okay, it says participants are typing. Technology. Okay, we have our first one in which says designing the technology. Exactly. Yeah, these are really good ones. So tool fitting into other set of tools. How do we make all of these tools work with one another? Upgrading of tools. Yeah, documentation is an interesting one in the DevTools space that I feel that it's a given that DevTools need a lot of documentation. Cross-platform compatibility, very much so. I guess Docker helps in a certain extent there. Overlap of tools. Yeah, which one do you pick? Which sort of goes back to this initial point, right? Deciding the technology and deciding the tools that you want to use. So a lot of these tools probably do a lot of similar things. Which one do you pick? Choosing a tool to solve a client issue. Yeah, exactly. So this is exactly what we are also looking at Docker. So some of the things that we're trying to do is also solve this idea of having to use like these multiple tools. Cross-platform compatibility is also a good problem for Docker as well. Okay. Oh, convincing your manager, yes. That's a different skill set altogether. So tool management, as you can see, is a really huge issue, right? Like same tool, different abstraction. Yeah, that's also a good one. Now, on the other hand, I would love to know, so what are the most delightful aspects of dev tooling today? So what do you like about the tools that you use today? Again, you don't have to name specific tools necessarily if you don't want to, but I would love to know what is it that you like about it? Oh, that's great. Considering it's a Docker meetup, it's great to see that containers. It's nice. Standardization is a tricky one. because every time you come up with the standard, I feel with new technology and things like that, it changes way too quickly to standardize things. New tools and ecosystem support, single file, all configuration. Yeah, willing to adapt. Yeah, there is, I think, some joy to take into like exploring new technology every day as well. I think it's nice to learn new things, as long as it's not taking away time from what you actually want to do. It being platform agnostic. Open source technology and community support. Yes. Okay, great. I'll move on, and I'll tie back into our answers from today. I see. Yes, GitHub is a good tool for sure. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about the role of design in all of this, right? Also tie into some of the answers that you were talking about. But before that, since I'm talking to developers, maybe I'll give you a little bit of insight to what designers do, because there is some misunderstanding of what designers do generally. So the term user experience design is not a very old term. So it was kind of introduced only in the 1990s, right? Whereas if you look at programming, I think the first programming language was by Ada Lovelace in like 1843 or something like that. So, which means that design itself as a career path has been quite a new introduction. So, design is trying to always play a little bit of catch up to like technology, and we still haven't reached a stage where everyone has a good understanding of what designers do, of what design is. So it's just a little bit of history of like where design started. It was developed by it was introduced by Donald Norman, who was working at Apple, and he came up with this term as user experience design. Now, if you've been to any presentation of a designer, they've probably shown you this graphic, which talks about what we do as design, right? Because design is almost always conceived as this perceived as this thing where we come make things pretty and then we hand it over to developers to implement. But there's a lot more that we do as designers. Like I was mentioning earlier, we think about these bigger problems and try to come up with ideas and solutions in order to solve it. And the way we get to it is by doing a ton of user research. So trying to understand what are the actual problems users are facing, and then come up with some concepts, and then come up with like screen flows, wireframes, etc. And ultimately we come up with like visual design. But visual design is such a small, it's not necessarily a small part, but it is just one part of what we do as designers. So it is not about just making things look good, but it's about trying to find the best solution for to the problem by closely speaking to our users, for example. So the official definition of user experience design is that it is user experience is the holistic journey users traverse as they use a product. Not only does it include their direct interactions with the product, but also how it fits in their overall task completion process. So the famous example that people always use is Apple, right? So Apple does not start that design process with just the products that we use. They start that design process from right from how they sell it in their stores, how they train their employees in the stores, then how their products are built, be it the hardware, the software, but also how their servicing is done. So when you think about products like open source products like Docker, it's not just about the product like Docker Desktop or Docker CLI or Docker Hub. It's also about encouraging the community, right? Which is why all of these meetups are held as well. It's also about focusing and about not only encouraging, but also ensuring we are listening to the community and the product reflects the community's needs, for example. So it's just not about like sitting and designing these products in a silo. So developer experience. So to me, the word developer experience, I didn't know that there was a word developer experience, because when I look at any product, it's any user of a product is user experience to me. But there is a term called developer experience, which is inspired by user experience practice, and it sees developers as a special case of users. So developer experience design is the practice of understanding how developers get their work done and optimizing that experience. So which means that as designers, I think there are not too many designers in this space currently, but it's probably one of the best parts about it is there's so much opportunity for good design as well. So essentially what it means is that we as designers are trying to understand developers' needs, which is challenging if you don't have too much of a technical background, and then trying to build better products for developers. Now, with developer experience, I don't believe that it's only designers who need to play a role in it. Over the years, I've also seen like the DevOps role starting to play a very significant role, right? More and more you go with all of these tools, all of this technology, you see a lot of folks also getting into the DevOps space who tend to manage all of this. So, some of the biggest challenges like I've come across so far. So I haven't been working at Docker for too long. I've been working since October last year. So the whole dev tool space is very new to me, and I'm trying to understand what the challenges in this space are. So some of the biggest challenges that I've at least come across, and I've sourced it from this developer media, is that one, like we spoke about, so getting started with new tools, managers, and build and deploy processes. The second one, wrapping your head around a new way of completing old familiar tasks. Third one, potentially learning new languages in order to use new tech. Fifth, having to constantly refer to docs instead of having it all in your head. So the sixth one says understanding what functionality is and it's not available to you. And the sixth one is like learning new design patterns. Seventh one is like finding time to practice. Now, if you look at a lot of these challenges, I genuinely believe that design can play a huge role in helping solve some of these problems to a certain extent, at least, right? In order to, for instance, finding a new way to complete old and familiar tasks, I think with good user-friendly developer tools, this can really help. Potentially learning new languages. I think the onboarding of developer tools isn't the best necessarily. I think they can definitely do a better job, and design can play a role in this. Constantly having to refer to docs. This is also an interesting thing I've seen with developer tools, that the documentation, I think the documentation is a lot more vast than other products, but I don't see as much contextual help within developer tools as much as I would imagine it would be. So understanding what functionality is not available to you and is available to you is also something design can solve. And of course, learning new design patterns is in our forte as well. Now, some of the design challenges we have in the space is how do we design for all these different types of developers, right? So how do we design for front-end developers, back-end developers, full-stack developers, experienced developers, not experienced developers, but also all the possible number of use cases. So how do we come up with good solutions that work for all of these different types of developers and type of use cases? But it is an interesting problem to have again. It seems quite challenging and intimidating, but nevertheless. So when you look at a normal product, so any product I worked on until I reached this DevTool space, it's quite a linear flow. You look at, I don't know, e-commerce product, you look at Amazon, for instance, it's still a very, very linear flow. Or you look at anything to do with your education sector, it's again a very linear flow. Whereas with the DevTool, it's a very chaotic flow because there's so many things that are happening simultaneously. So how can we build a good design for it is one of the challenges that we're looking into. But also all the different contexts. For instance, there's an immediate context. Let's say you're just debugging something. There's an intermediate context where you're working at an app level. You're seeing what microservices are connected to this app, etc., and what data is coming in, what's going on. And then there's like a larger scope, like the OS scope or beyond, or maybe you're deploying something to your Kubernetes cluster. So there are also these different contexts that we need to think about when it comes to the dev tool space. Okay, design at Docker. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my experience so far at Docker. So, Docker comes out as one of the more popular tools, right, when Stack Overflow survey. So this was news to me. So I was very familiar with Git, like ever since I was a developer back in time. But Docker, Kubernetes, and all of these things were quite new to me. So Docker seems to come up as like one of the favorite tools. So when I got into the space, one of the things that I try to do is, what is it that people like about this tool, and why is this tool so popular? And at Docker, when I joined the company, basically, if you look at Docker's values, one of their core values is developer obsession, which means that they're constantly trying to understand the needs of the developer. They seek their feedback and then accordingly try to build products. And this, to me, says a lot about a company in the DevTool space. Anyway, so now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Docker extensions and tie it all in. So I guess I just have a question as to how many of you have heard of Docker extensions and how many of you have tried it. You can just raise your hand. Okay. Okay, by the end of this talk, I'm hoping that I can get more of you to try this. But so the first thing I started working on when I joined Docker was Docker extensions. At this point, there were absolutely no extensions, right? So the brief was we want to introduce extensions. How do we go about it? So the first thing I did again, when I joined as a designer is I started asking the stakeholders, for instance, everyone involved in making this decision within the company as to why does Docker want to build extensions? What do we want to achieve with building extensions? Now, some of the things when I asked you about the pain points, you mentioned were that understanding all of these different tools, right? Like, and keeping up with these different tools. So developers work in really complex environments and use multiple tools for different tasks. So why not bring it to one place? Again, the things that you mentioned that you like are things like standardization. So you don't have to learn new design patterns. You don't have to open like 10 windows to work on different things. So we aim to do something like this with Docker extensions and create like consistent experiences across these and introduce the right level of abstraction. So this is also, as I understand, a problem with dev tooling, to make sure that we don't try to abstract things too much and try to figure out what the right balance is. Now, what is the value that the second question I asked is, so what is the value that value add extensions currently build and bring in other products? So the concept of extensions and plugins are not new at all, right? So many other products use extensions and plugins. So the second thing I started doing is trying to benchmark as to what other products use extensions, how they're using it, what works well for them, what does not work well for them. So did a little bit of a competitor study and tried to understand a little bit more of extensions and what we would want to do with extensions within Docker. Okay, the third question I asked is, what extensions would developers like to see as part of Docker Desktop? Now, there are so many tools out there. So what is it that we would like to see, which would make sense to introduce as part of Docker Desktop? So in order to do this, as a designer, we did a bunch of like user interviews. We spoke to a lot of developers, experienced developers, not so experienced developers, and asked them what their favorite tools are and why they use it, what they like about this tool, what they dislike about this tool. And then we tried to come up with a set of tools which we thought would make sense to introduce with the initial version of Docker Desktop. So Docker extensions is currently in its beta format. And the next thing was, how can our extension partners deliver the best possible experience to developers? So in this, my role was essentially working as a consultant to partners to help improve their UX, and so that you have like the best possible experience with extensions within Docker Desktop. So going back to the what if questions, right? So when I work in each sector, I try to think about these what if questions. It helps me frame the problem well and accordingly come up with solutions. So at Docker, the what if question that I kind of framed was, what if developers, this is specific to extensions by the way, what if developers could access all their favorite tools through one interface through a seamless experience? Because this is one of the problems in this tool space, is there's too many, you don't know what to choose, and the experience is inconsistent across these different tools. So maybe these could be the problems that we try to solve with Docker extensions. So we just introduced Docker extensions at DockerCon, which happened in May. And so far, it seems to be good. Users seem to like all the extensions in the marketplace. And we want to introduce more and more of these extensions, right, as we go on, and introduce more tools that developers would find interesting. So with extensions, the next things that we're working on is improve discoverability of extensions, which means that how can we help users determine which extensions would be useful to them? How best can we help personalize your extension experience? So if you're using this, and this technology, how best can we tell you that these extensions could be useful to you? Supporting the community in building extensions. So like like I was saying, user experience is not just about like designing these screens and putting it out there, right? We also want to figure out how we can engage the community to build extensions, and also understanding what extensions would be a useful part of Docker Desktop. So we don't want to just introduce any and every tool. We want to make sure that it makes sense to have it within Docker Desktop. Okay, so my next question to you is that if at all you would like to see an extension in Docker Desktop, what would it be? So any kind of tool that you would like to see as part of Docker Desktop, I would love to know. Or anything that you feel is missing in Docker Desktop or Docker CLI that you would like to just see. Need not be an extension. Yes, we did release Lens recently. Okay, build tools. Can someone tell me a little bit more about build tools? What is it that you would like to see? It's okay if you want to remain anonymous, but if you'd like to tell me more, I'd love to hear about that. APM, okay. Something tells me all of these are topics for today. Yeah, monitoring tools is also an interesting area. I think we have some scanning extensions currently. We don't necessarily have some monitoring ones, but I think there's a lot of scope for monitoring tools. Container security tools, yes. Yeah, we have a bunch of scanning tools currently, though. So if you haven't tried extensions, you should try those out. Docker logs. So we have an extension called, which is an internal extension that Docker has built called Logs Explorer, where we have tried to improve our logs experience, because currently you can kind of just see the logs of one particular container. So with Logs Explorer, you can see the logs of multiple containers. For example, you have advanced queries that you can do. So I would love for you to test that out. And also, there's a feedback section in each page in Docker Desktop. If you'd like to see additional features, please give us feedback. Database UI management like Redis Insights. Okay, that's an interesting one. Analyze Docker file and ways to optimize this. So we have an extension for this as well called Slim AI, which kind of analyzes your Docker file. So I would recommend testing that out. A better way to push images to the repo with extension. Yes, we have a long way to go with this, right? With building consistency between Docker Hub and Docker Desktop, but it's definitely on our agenda to do this, and we'll get there. Docker Copilot. Okay, I'm not too sure what that one is. Security and scanning, a bunch of them are introduced. Seems like essential executing into multiple containers as well. Okay. Nice. Thank you so much for all the suggestions. So, yeah, it's one of the things I'm also going to do is take in some suggestions for today and take it to my team and see what tools we want to introduce, because we have about 15 extensions now, but we're also releasing new extensions every month or as and when extensions come in. And also to let you know, so extensions are not just partner extensions, right? If you are interested in building an extension for Docker Desktop, you're most welcome to. So we have the documentation, and if you're familiar with Docker documentation, it's docs.docker.com, and then there is a link for you to, like, with the